Welcome to this presentation covering Chapter 11 of our textbook. Our topic for this chapter are third-party contracts. I really enjoy this topic. I'm not quite sure why, but I hope that you'll find it as interesting as I find it. So let's get started with the topic. So let's begin by defining what is a third-party contract. The textbook author adds the word beneficiary between third party and contract, which is fine. You don't really need it, but it's fine to add it, because whether you talk about a third party contract or a third party beneficiary contract, you're talking about the same thing. It is a contract made for the benefit of a third person. And you can see all the terms here. Beneficiary obviously is, you can see the first several letters are the beginning of the word benefit. And of course, the third party is just another term for a third person. And third person is a legal term. You hear it pretty commonly, and I think even people not in the legal business use the term fairly commonly. If it's not one that you're familiar with, though, please pause and think about it for a second. This definition actually isn't provided by the textbook, but I'm adding it just in the event that you're not familiar with the concept. If you think about a contract, you might think about there being two parties to the contract. So here we'll call this first person Albert, and we have Belinda over here, okay? We might call Albert the first party to the contract, and we might call Belinda the second party to the contract. They're going to enter into a contract, and they're going to be in privity with each other. Albert signs on the dotted line, and Belinda signs on the dotted line. In that case, really, you could call Belinda the first party and Albert the second party. It doesn't really matter the order. You'll see it sometimes in very old contracts where they'll actually define Albert as, say, the first party, or maybe they'll define Belinda as the first party. And so instead of repeatedly saying Belinda Smith or Albert Harris, they'll say Belinda Smith, and they'll define in parentheses the first party. And then going forward, they'll always say the first party. But the assignment of who's the first party and who's the second party is, kind of arbitrary. I suppose if Belinda's your client, you'll probably make her the first party if you're the one writing the contract. And if Albert's your client and you're writing the contract, you'll make him the first party. But in any event, they really mean the same thing. They're the parties who signed on the dotted line. And even if it's an oral contract, they're the ones who are, quote unquote, signing on the metaphorical dotted line. The rest of the universe, everybody who isn't Albert and Belinda, we'll call that person Carl over here. He's a third party to the contract. He's not Albert. He's not Belinda. He's not the first party. He's not the second party. So he's the third party. And as you can imagine, the world is full of third parties. In fact, everybody in the world who isn't Albert and who isn't Belinda is a third party. You and I are third parties to Albert and Belinda's contract. Basically, if there's we'll say 7 billion people in the world, well, 7 billion minus 2 of those people are third parties to this contract, meaning that they haven't signed on the dotted line. They don't have any contractual obligations under the contract. But most of us in the world who are third parties to third parties and with respect to the contract really don't care about Albert and Belinda's contract. I mean, not to be mean, but we just aren't interested. We're not affected by it one way or the other. So really, most of the time when we talk about third parties, we're really talking about somebody like Carl, somebody who didn't sign on the dotted line, who doesn't have any contractual obligations under the contract, but still is pretty darn interested in that contract for whatever reason. There can be lots of different reasons. We'll go through many of them, but probably not all of them. So this isn't somebody, you can imagine somebody, we'll say somebody, Svetlana in Moscow, Svetlana over here, and Albert and Belinda are in, Plano, Texas. Carl's in Plano, Texas. Everything Albert and Belinda are doing is going to happen in Plano, Texas. Svetlana is a third person to the contract. She doesn't even know Albert. She doesn't even know Belinda. She doesn't know even that Plano, Texas exists. She has no interest in this contract, and Albert and Belinda have no interest in her. But there really isn't a point in having a chapter in a textbook about Svetlana's relationship with the contract and her relationship with Albert and Belinda, because it's, a big fat zero. So we're going to focus on people that have some kind of connection, maybe very tenuous, but some kind of connection with this transaction. So Svetlana isn't the focus of our attention in this chapter. It's going to be someone like Carl, who's connected some way or another to this contract. He is the third person. I like this way of looking at third persons. I remember this when I had young children. Imagine this is my husband and he's tossing one of my children in the air. And you can see here, this is how Daddy sees it. He's tossing little Johnny up in the air, all very safe and perfectly appropriate. There's no risk of him dropping little Johnny or Johnny getting hurt. It's just they're having a fun time. The child, it's a little bit more thrilling for him. It feels like Daddy's really throwing me high, but he probably also feels pretty safe. He knows he can trust his daddy. His daddy's going to catch him, but still, it's pretty thrilling, maybe even a little bit scary. So Daddy is the first person, we'll say, and little Johnny or little Sarah is the second person, the kid being thrown up in the air. Mom, though, is the third person. She is neither throwing anyone up in the air, nor is she being thrown. She's seeing it from the sidelines, and she's terrified. It seems like surely there's no way that her husband, the father of little Johnny or Sarah, could possibly catch little Johnny or Sarah, and he's throwing the baby so high that if he doesn't catch the baby's going to die, right? So this is an illustration of what we talk about when we talk about third persons. The third person perspective is the person who is not involved in the particular transaction, even though that third person may be very interested in the transaction. The mom is very interested in this, even though she is not one of the parties involved. Okay. So we're going to go through several scenarios. I think one of the reasons I like this chapter is because we've got a lot of pretty neat scenarios. They're kind of more involved than most of the stories we've done in this presentation, and so it's kind of neat to spend a little bit of time talking in more detail about some fact patterns. So this is the first one we're going to talk about. Let's imagine for a second that Lisa is a college student. She's away at school, and she's had some car trouble over the course of the semester. She's also gotten on the dean's list, and so Dad's very, very pleased with her. Dad just gotten a big promotion at work, so he's got a little bit more money, and he decides, you know what? I'm going to surprise Lisa. I'm going to get her a new car. She's worked so hard academically. I'm going to treat her in this way. So Dad goes to the car dealership. Maybe it's something he does on the internet. Maybe he physically goes to it. Let's say that Lisa is at Stephen F. Austin in Nacogdoches. Dad lives in Collin County. He decides to deal with the car dealership. Let's assume though he's doing this over the telephone and maybe over the internet, making this transaction. Anyway, he selects the car, and it's a pretty good car, pretty good used car. It's a $10,000 car. And the car dealer is saying, listen, Dad, if you give me the $10,000 for the car, we'll deliver it to Lisa's dorm. We'll even put a beautiful red bow on the car. And we'll go up to her dorm room, we'll knock on the door, and we'll give her the keys, and she'll be so thrilled. Okay, so Dad is, thinking this is the best way of doing it. But the contract, we can see, is actually not involving Lisa directly. Lisa has no obligations in the contract. She doesn't have to give the car dealer any money. She doesn't have to give anybody any car. She has no obligations. The dad does, though. He has to give the $10,000 to the car dealer. If he doesn't give the $10,000 to the car dealer is not going to give Lisa the car. On the other hand, the car dealer has obligations under this contract. If Dad gives the car dealer $10,000 and the car dealer doesn't give the car to Lisa, Dad is going to sue the car dealer for his $10,000 back. So they both have obligations under the contract. But you may notice in this scenario that Dad does not directly benefit from this contract. He's not acting charitably in the sense of he's donating the money to the car dealership because he thinks the car dealership is so meritorious. No, he is doing this because of his feelings of affection for his daughter, Lisa. But Lisa's an adult. I mean, he has no legal obligation to continue to furnish transportation for her, but moms and dads sometimes are able to do this for their kids. And so in this scenario, it doesn't appear legally that dad is benefiting from this transaction because he is giving something to the car dealership, but the car dealership isn't giving dad anything back. The car dealership is actually giving Lisa the car. Now, in some sense, the car dealer doesn't really care whether he gives the keys to the car to dad or whether he gives the keys to the car to Lisa. I mean, the car dealership is going to be one car short or have one car less in its inventory either way. So because this is the contract that's entered into, Lisa isn't involved in it. We might even call Lisa a stranger to the contract. We would say that dad and the car dealership are in privity with each other. But we would say that Lisa is not in privity because she's not a party to the contract. We might call this car dealer the party to the first part, and we might call dad the party to the second part, or vice versa, either order. But we would definitely call Lisa a third party to the contract. We would call her a beneficiary to the contract because she's getting a pretty darn good thing out of this, right? And we would call her a Donee beneficiary. We can see in the word Donee, it looks like the word donate or donor, right? The beginning of donate and the beginning of donor is the same. But we see this EE ending, and we've seen this kind of throughout the course, so let me just do a little refresher. When you see a word in OR in the law, it means that it's about somebody who's doing, person who does whatever comes before it. So if it's a promisor, it's somebody who does the promise. If it's a donor, it's somebody who does the donation. If it's an offeror, it's somebody who does or makes the offer. When we see an EE ending, we say this is somebody who receives whatever it is, person who receives. So a promisee is someone who receives the promise. An offeree is someone who receives the offer. A donee is somebody who receives, receives the donation. And that is her position with respect to the contract. She's a Donee beneficiary. We'll look in more detail about that. It's important to be able to know what everybody's role in this transaction is. 2 people in privity, 1 person not in privity, a third party beneficiary, particularly a Donee beneficiary. Okay, let's go to our next slide. Okay, so we need to have kind of 3 people in this transaction. We need to have a promisor, a promisee, and a beneficiary. Let's go back and look at this situation and see. In a contract, we usually have our parties in privity are both promisees and promisors. Dad is a promisor with respect to the $10,000. He has promised to give this money to the car dealer. So with respect to this, he's a promisor. And the car dealer is a promisee. With respect to the new car, the car dealer is the promisor. He's promising to give the new car to somebody. And dad is the promisee. He is promising to receive that. Now, he himself isn't receiving it, but the person that he is designated, that he is choosing to be the recipient, is going to receive it. So you can see that the car dealer is a promisee with respect to this and a promisor with respect to this. Dad is a promisor with respect to this and a promisee with respect to this. Now, when we're talking about third-party beneficiary examples, we don't focus on this one because Lisa's really not involved in this one. Lisa's involved in this one, the thing that's leaving our contractual twosome here and going out here. So when we talk about promisee and promisor, we're focusing upon this particular promise. So in this case, we would call the car dealer the promisor, and we'd call the dad the promisee, and we'd call Lisa the beneficiary with respect to this. So all of it's in relationship to this promise. Doesn't mean that there isn't the other promise, it's just not what we're focused on. So it's very helpful to be able to make those those choices. And again, who's a beneficiary? The person who's getting the benefit. And of course, here we're focusing on this particular contract. Lease is the beneficiary. Okay, so now we're going to divide up the world of beneficiaries into two categories, intended and incidental beneficiaries. Let's first of all focus on the intended beneficiaries. We can tell kind of by the initial word here where we're going. An intended beneficiary is a beneficiary who is intended to benefit, right? And of course, who's intending it? Well, the parties to the contract. So an intended beneficiary is a third party who will specifically benefit from the contract. Going back to this transaction, Dad specifically wanted Lisa to benefit. I mean, Dad's very unlikely to say to the car dealer, hey, I'm going to give you $10,000. I want you to give the car, I don't really care who you give it to, just, I mean, whoever, just, give it to somebody. I mean, I suppose it's possible there's some really, really rich person out there that might do that, but that would be a really unusual circumstance. It's almost certain that Dad is very focused on getting it into a particular person's hands. He really wants Lisa to get the car, not just any random junior at Stephen F. Austin, for example. Okay, so you can see that the beneficiary is going to be spelled out very, very clearly. Now, within the universe of intended beneficiaries, we like to think of them having two subcategories. We have a Donee beneficiary and we have a creditor beneficiary. So let's consider what a Donee beneficiary is. This is a third-party beneficiary to a contract, right? So we already knew that. That relates to the beneficiary part. The benefit is in the form of a gift, which may be, in some cases, revoked. So here, we can see again, we have the beginning of the word donate. Again, that reminds us of gift, right? So that can help us make that connection. So a donee person is the person to whom a gift is made. So let's assume that Dad and the car dealer have made this arrangement, and Dad says, listen, Lisa's on spring break right now, so don't deliver the car today. She's going to be back on Monday, so deliver it then. And let's say while Lisa's on spring break, say she goes to South Padre, and she gets herself into some trouble. She gets arrested for public drunkenness or something. And Dad has to bail her out. Dad's like, oh, I don't want to give her a car now. So Dad calls up the car dealer and says, you know what? I know I told you to deliver the car to Lisa, but no, I don't want you to do that now. I'm going to take possession of the car. Is the car dealer okay with that? Sure. Car dealer doesn't care who gets it. It's no longer the car dealer's car to deal with. If Dad wants it, instead of it going to Lisa, no skin off the car dealer's nose. You can see in that situation that the promise has been revoked, and the gift isn't going to the intended donee. But let's imagine a different scenario. Let's say this time Dad is giving the car to Lisa right before spring break. After all, she's going to need some wheels to get down to South Padre. So the car dealer gets the car to Lisa right, the day before the long road trip. Lisa gets to South Padre. She gets into trouble. Now Dad is pretty mad at the car dealer. Well, why'd you deliver the car? Car dealer's like, you told us to. And the dad says, well, now I want you to go and repossess the car from Lisa. Car dealer's gonna be like, that's your problem. We did what we were supposed to do, which was you told us to give it to Lisa and we did it. And if you want to get the car from Lisa, that's kind of on you at this point. We're out of this now, buddy. That's what they would say, because we're beyond the time that it can be revoked, right? Who knows how they arranged it. It could be that the title of the car is in Lisa's name, or maybe it was in the dad's name, but that's for an issue for another day. So we can see how a donee beneficiary situation works. Now let's think about the creditor beneficiary scenario. This is when we have a creditor, someone who has made a loan, extended some line of credit or some other financial arrangement with a debtor. And that creditor may be a beneficiary to a contract made between the debtor and a third person. We're going to talk in more detail about this scenario in a few minutes, but this is a major important category of ways that creditors want to have arrangements made. Obviously, a creditor is interested in getting paid, right? The creditor wants to make sure that he gets his money back. And so one of the ways to do that is by naming the creditor as a third-party beneficiary to the contract. This category is not being done out of the goodness of anybody's heart. This one is, but this one is not. This is a cold, cool, calculated, self-interested business transaction. Now let's consider the incidental beneficiary category. This is in contrast to an intended beneficiary. So we are either in this first bucket when we're talking about beneficiaries, intended beneficiaries, or incidental beneficiaries. If you're Lisa, or whomever the third party is, you very much want to be in the world of intended beneficiaries, because incidental beneficiaries, you probably gathered because of the name, are not sitting pretty. So what is an incidental beneficiary? It's a person to whom the benefits of a contract between two other people accrue merely as a matter of happenstance. Let's consider for a second Pete. We'll just put a P here. Pete works for, we'll say he works for the car dealership. Actually, he doesn't work for the car dealership. He has his own little business. And whenever the car dealership needs to deliver cars to purchasers, the car dealer calls up Pete and says, hey, Pete, we want you to pick up this car and deliver it to this particular address. And Pete gets paid, we'll say, $200 for this. And so when the dad and the car dealer are negotiating this, the car dealer is thinking, well, we'll just hire Pete to get the car from our lot where we keep all of our cars to the dorm parking lot where Lisa goes to school. So that's kind of in the back of the car dealer's mind. It may even be that the car dealer calls up Pete and says, hey, Pete, we think we have this deal going forward where we're going to need to get a car from our lot to this one of the Stephen F. Austin dormitory lots. Could you do this on Tuesday afternoon between noon and 3? Pete looks at his schedule. He goes, yeah, it looks like I can. My usual fee is $200. Is that going to work? Yeah, that'll work for us. Okay. So Pete's thinking, I'm going to get some money. This is a good situation for me. Then dad and the car dealer get into this contract, but something falls through. Dad's check bounces, or maybe the car dealer inadvertently sells that car to somebody else before it can be delivered to Lisa. It may be that dad has a lawsuit with the car dealership. Maybe the car dealership has a lawsuit with dad. But Pete is thinking to himself, wait a second, I was going to make $200. Now I'm not going to make $200. I want to sue somebody. I want to sue whoever caused that contract to go south, because I now am not going to earn the $200 that I was going to earn. Pete, under this situation, is an incidental beneficiary. Dad never wanted to enter into this contract to help Pete. He probably doesn't even know Pete exists. I mean, he has nothing against Pete, but he didn't think to himself, you know what, I want to buy a car for my daughter Lisa just so Pete can get a job delivering the car. That did not occur to Dad. The car dealer also wasn't really thinking about helping Pete out when it entered into the contract with Dad. He wasn't thinking, gosh, we really need to make sure this deal goes forward because poor Pete, he needs some money and we really want to help him out. Nope. Car dealer's happy to enter into the relationship with Pete, but it's not really focused on helping Pete out. It's focused on the car dealership, just like Dad is focused on Dad and I guess Lisa. Nobody in this transaction is thinking very much at all about Pete. So Pete is an incidental beneficiary. And if the deal falls through somehow, Pete is left out to dry. He cannot successfully sue to enforce such a contract. So Pete is an example of an incidental beneficiary. Pete is the incidental beneficiary. Another category that is commonly an incidental beneficiary is employees. Let's go back to our example here and think about the car dealers. Let's pretend that this time Pete is the salesperson who's transacting this with Dad. So now we have, another Pete. Same name, same spelling, but there's lots of Petes in this town, we'll say. So Pete is a salesperson at this dealership. Well, Pete wants this deal to go forward because he gets his commission. We'll say he gets 10%. And so he's thinking, I'm going to be out of pocket $1,000. This is sweet. I want this deal to happen. But you know what? Something falls through. Dad takes the car to the inspection place. Maybe he has an auto mechanic who inspects it. The auto mechanic goes, nah, this car's not that good, not reliable enough. Okay, so Dad decides not to complete the transaction. Poor Pete, the salesman, is pretty bummed. He just was already thinking how he could spend that $1,000. He is not, though, the intended beneficiary of this contract. It would have been Lisa. The car dealer is not the same as the employee of the car dealer. The car dealer may decide, you know what, this transaction doesn't make sense for it. It's not focused on, I'm not saying it's trying to harm its employees, but it's not focused on, well, what's good for our employees? No, it's focused on its own bottom line. So either way, whether Pete has his own business delivering cars or he's a salesperson, in either scenario, he is an incidental beneficiary. This doesn't mean that he's not genuinely concerned and interested in this transaction going forward. It doesn't mean he doesn't have skin in the game. It just means that he isn't the reason the parties are entering into the contract. So we can see the distinction between Pete and Lisa. Lisa is an intended beneficiary, Pete not so much. Okay. Here we have kind of a picture of this that maybe will help us make sense of this. So we have our two categories, intended beneficiaries and incidental beneficiaries. And again, we can get more granular on intended beneficiaries and separate that into creditor beneficiaries and Donee beneficiaries. This is a legal duty is owed because, again, the creditor is owed money by the debtor, and the debtor is one of the parties to the contract. And therefore, the creditor beneficiary has the right to enforce that underlying contract. Donee beneficiaries are usually just getting a gift, and the donor is one of the parties to the contract. So usually there isn't a right of enforcement by the Donee beneficiary. But actually the Donee beneficiary has a better chance of enforcement than the incidental beneficiary, than the Petes of the world, because their benefit, even though it may be very significant, is indirect, and they just aren't going to have a right of enforcement at all. Okay, so let's consider this scenario. Here we go. So in order to qualify as the intended beneficiary, the potential beneficiary must meet one of these criteria. So you just need one. I'm just going to put or here, or. And you can see, here's our picture. The promisee is doing something for the promisor, and the promisor is saying, because you're going to do this for me, I'm going to do this for your beneficiary. So the promisee, this guy, the one who's doing something for the promisor, intended the beneficiary to benefit. Again, that would be Dad, is the promisee giving the $10,000 to the car dealership who's promising to give the money to Lisa. Certainly Dad in this scenario meant for Lisa to get it, or the beneficiary relied upon the contractual rights conferred to him or her. Now, in my first version of this scenario, Lisa had no idea that this contract was even being entered into. Remember, Dad was going to surprise Lisa, but oftentimes that's not the way things are. Maybe Lisa is actually doing the test drive with Dad, is fully involved in the negotiations, is telling Dad, Daddy, I want that car, not that car. I want this feature, not that feature. She may be very, very involved in this transaction, and she might actually be doing things or changing her position with respect to it. Let's say she currently has a car. Well, maybe she says, well, I know I'm getting this car from the car dealer because Daddy's going to sign on the dotted line, and so I can go ahead and sell my clunker. And so she might go ahead and sell the car as a result of the fact that she's going to get this other car. And so she relied upon the fact that she was going to be able to get that car. So that would be an example of reliance. It's got to be a reasonable reliance, but that could be a scenario where Lisa relied. Also, the performance ran directly from the promisor to the beneficiary. And you can see in our scenario that certainly happened. Literally, the car dealer drives it over to Lisa for delivery. So any of those can happen to make the beneficiary the intended beneficiary. But still keep in mind, an intended beneficiary does not automatically have rights of enforcement. in our scenario, Lisa's still the Donee beneficiary. She very possibly doesn't have rights of enforcement, not like a creditor beneficiary. We'll drill down and talk about that in a few minutes. Okay. The classic example of a Donee beneficiary is not the car dealership scenario. It's actually the life insurance policy. Imagine for a second that I am 30 years old, I get married, and I decide that I want to buy a life insurance policy, and I want to make my husband the beneficiary of the policy. And so every month I pay on that policy. Let's assume that I am using money that I inherited before I got married. So it's my separate property from a legal basis. Community assets aren't being used at all. And I pay, we'll say, $100 a month to maintain this policy. I pay promptly every single month. And let's assume that I live to be 90 years old. On my 90th birthday, I drop dead of a heart attack. My husband has survived me, and he is going through my papers, and he finds the life insurance policy, and he says, wow, okay, I am named the beneficiary. I am going to go and file a claim with the insurance company. And so he calls up the insurance company, says, hey, you know, my wife has passed away. She had life insurance through your entity. I am the named beneficiary. I want to collect the policy. The life insurance company says, well, you know, send us a copy of the death certificate. So widower sends a copy of the death certificate. Everything seems legit. The life insurance company says, well, you know what? The insured, your late wife, was the promisee. She was in privity with us. We had a contract. And she paid all those premiums in. She made the promise to pay. So this is her promise that she made. So with respect to the premium, she was the promisor, and we were the promisee. And then she said she was the promisee with respect to the proceeds from the life insurance company. We were the promisor. So she can sue us to enforce the promise. Go ahead and tell her to sue us because we're not going to pay on our own. And of course, the widower says, well, I mean, she can't sue. She's, you know, dead. That's kind of the point. And the life insurance company says, oh, we're so sorry that she passed away. But, you know, if she starts feeling better, just tell her to go ahead and sue us. Well, no, I mean, you know, she's dead. It's a done deal. She's not going to be suing anybody because, you know, she's dead, right? Oh, well, too bad, so sad for you because she's the one that we were in privity with. She's the only one who can sue us, and, you know, she's dead, so I guess she can't really sue us. So we're just not going to pay. But thanks for all those premiums all those years. That's awesome. Does that sound like the way insurance works? You can see if that's really the way insurance works, no one would ever buy a life insurance policy, right? Because the only time that they could ever collect is after they're dead. And if they couldn't sue to enforce because they're, you know, dead, and the life insurance company could get out of paying, no one would ever buy the policy to begin with. So we do allow for the beneficiary to collect, to sue if the insurance company refuses to pay. So this is, again, the situation. The promisee is the insured. Of course, we're talking about the promisee to pay the proceeds from the life insurance policy. The insurance company is a promisor, and the beneficiary, the named beneficiary, the person that the insured has specified, is the Donee beneficiary. He can sue. But let's change up the facts a little bit. Let's say, we'll go back to our scenario. I'm 30 years old. I get married. I buy the insurance policy. And then I discover when I'm 89 and a half years old that my husband has been cheating on me. Well, I immediately call up my insurance company and say, I want to change my beneficiary. I want to make it my great aunt, I guess my great aunt Mabel will be dead by then. I want to make it my great nephew, Harold. I want to make him the beneficiary. Maybe I don't even tell my husband. So anyway, I die of the heart attack on my 90th birthday. The husband is going through the paperwork, sees the insurance policy, calls up the insurance company and says, well, I'm calling to collect on the insurance. And the insurance company says, well, send us a copy of the death certificate. So the widower does so. And the life insurance company goes, yep, you're right. She had a policy. It was fully paid up, but you're not the beneficiary. You were the beneficiary until 6 months ago, but now it's Harold, her great nephew. Could my husband sue and say, but I was the beneficiary for all those years. Surely I can sue under the policy and get the proceeds. Nope, because the beneficiary hadn't vested. The moment of vesting of the right to collect is the second I drop dead. I could have had him the beneficiary up until 5 minutes before I change it. But it's who is the beneficiary the moment that I pass away. That person, his rights vest into those times. Typically, the insured can change the beneficiary without obtaining the beneficiary's consent or even knowledge up until the point where the person dies. There are a few scenarios where that isn't true, that there needs to be knowledge, but it's kind of beyond the scope of this class. And we call the right vesting when it becomes an irrevocable designation. That's usually going to happen when the insured passes away. And that at that moment is when the beneficiary can sue to enforce the terms. Now we're for the creditor beneficiary scenario. Okay, so let's consider the creditor beneficiary. So again, this is just like the Donee beneficiary. He's an intended beneficiary, so he's in that category. He's not an incidental beneficiary. The creditor beneficiary is a third party to whom the promisee owes a legal duty. You can see this picture looks not exactly, but virtually exactly like the picture we saw in this previous, right? And we've got the triangular formation here. So here we have where the promisor is. This is where we have the insurance company. And we have the insured is where we have the promisee. And this is where we had the Donee beneficiary over here. So it's basically the same picture. But the one difference is that where we have gift here, which suggests no legal obligation, we do have a legal obligation here. That's a difference that makes a difference. Okay, so the creditor beneficiary is a third party to whom the promisee, this guy, owes a duty. So there is already this legal relationship. The promisee may pay amount due and owing by the promisor to the creditor beneficiary. So basically what the promisee is saying is, hey, instead of paying the creditor directly, like this, sending a check here, I'm going to use the promisor as a mechanism to get that paid. And the creditor beneficiary has a right to enforce the original contract in the event of breach. Okay, so he can enforce this contract, whatever that duty is, and he can also enforce this contract. So he has quite a bit more tools in his arsenal. This is an important tool. This is an important financing tool that our economy really, really uses to make these happen. I'm going to pause here and we're going to keep this image in your mind. We're going to fill in some more details so we go through an actual scenario with this triangle. Here we go. Here we go. So this is also in the module that we've been working with. So we have David Debtor owes a creditor company $1,000. This is probably a bank, but I wanted to keep the letters easy for us to follow. And it could be that the reason that the debt arose is because the creditor company is loaning David money, or it could be some other completely legitimate reason. This transaction, this contract, is something that happened before. This is like the prologue if you're thinking about a novel. This is not the main event in our deal. This is kind of background information. So this contract, though it is a contract most likely, isn't the contract that we're focusing on. So of course in this contract, these two entities would be in privity with each other, but this isn't the one we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on the next contract. So I'm actually going to make this one go away for a second because it's not the contract that we're focusing on. So now David Debtor somehow or another gives Paula Promiser $1,000. Now it could be good old-fashioned money, or it could be something of value that's $1,000 worth of value. It could be a service or it could be an item. For example, maybe David, my example is he paints Paula's living room, and Paula says, yeah, that's worth $1,000 to me. Or maybe he gives Paula, a sofa, not gives, but sells Paula a sofa for $1,000, for the equivalent of $1,000. Okay, so David is has promised to give this thing worth $1,000 to Paula Promiser. That's David Debtor's promise to Paula Promiser. So he is the promisor with respect to this $1,000, and Paula Promisor is the promisee. But that's not the promise that we're really going to focus on here. We're going to focus on Paula's half of the deal, because after all, David Debtor is not doing this out of the goodness of his heart. Paula Promiser promises to transfer $1,000 to David's company that he owes money to, Creditor company, so that David will no longer owe Creditor company any money. It's going to erase that debt. Though this arrangement between Paula and David is a contract, so of course David and Paula are in privity. Paula Promise is the promisor with respect to the transfer that's going to go to Creditor company, and she makes a promise to be enforced, which is of course paying the Creditor company $1,000. David Debtor is the promisee with respect to that particular promise. Again, David Debtor is making his own promise, so we're not focusing on that one. David's consideration for Paula's promise is the $1,000 that Paula Promise receives from David Debtor, or it could be, again, the service that David Debtor performs. Paula's consideration for David's payment or service to her is her promise to pay David's debt to the Creditor company. Under these circumstances, the Creditor company is a third-party beneficiary to David and Paula's contract. We wouldn't say that the Creditor company is in privity with respect to David's and Paula's contract, because the Creditor company has no obligations under the terms of the contract, and doesn't have to sign the contract, may not even initially be aware of the contract. If, despite her promise to David Debtor in the contract, Paula Promise refuses to pay the Creditor company the $1,000, Creditor company can sue Paula Promise for the $1,000 and prevail. Although Creditor Corporation is not a party to David and Paula's contract, both David Debtor and Paula Promiser intended that the Creditor company should be the beneficiary of the contract. Therefore, Creditor company has enforceable rights against Paula Promisor, since she was supposed to pay the creditor. In fact, either David Debtor or Creditor company may sue to enforce Paula Promiser's promise to pay. Creditor company's right to enforce the contract between David Debtor and Paula Promiser is effective only when Creditor company learns of and assents to David's and Paula's contract. Of course, Creditor company has another option too. Creditor company can also sue David Debtor directly for the $1,000 based upon this first contract, as David Debtor still has a legal duty to pay this loan despite his contract with Paula Promiser. David Debtor may then sue Paula Promiser for her breach of the contract, that is, for refusing to pay Creditor company. You can see why Creditor company still has to be able to sue directly, because otherwise David Debtor could just transfer his loan to Paula Promiser. And let's say Paula Promiser is, a homeless woman who has no assets. Well, if he could transfer his debt to Paula Promiser and be immune from Creditor company suing him directly, well, Creditor company would never get the money back. I mean, there's no benefit to suing a person that doesn't have any assets, and so Creditor company would not be able to recover, and yet would not be able to sue David Debtor. So you can see why we want Creditor company to have both avenues for recovery. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of how this works. It's a little bit tricky, and sometimes people get confused. So in our scenario, let's just look at this better. So Creditor company is this intended creditor beneficiary. B is David Debtor, and A is Paula Promiser. Let's go on from here. Okay, so now we're going to think about the incidental beneficiary. We've already kind of talked about this. Again, incidental beneficiary is by definition not an intended beneficiary. He only receives indirect benefits, and he has no rights to enforce. Again, the classic example of an incidental beneficiary is some kind of employee. It may be that the failure of the contract causes one of the parties to the contract to have to do layoffs or even to close its doors. So lots of people may be dramatically harmed by the breach, but they unfortunately don't have any rights to sue. So because they're incidental beneficiaries. An example here of maybe another way of looking at this is um, a professor such as myself has a contract with Collin College. Let's say I'm an awful instructor. Hopefully you don't think that about me, but I'm awful and you're not learning anything about contracts. You are not intended beneficiaries of the contract. So you can't sue Collin College and say, or you can't sue me for failing to satisfy my contractual terms with Collin College and say, well, you contracted with Collin College to be a good contracts instructor and you were really awful, and so we're going to sue you for breach. No, you're an incidental beneficiary. Now you might say, well, I mean, but the whole reason you're here is for the benefit of the students. Collin College hired you for this job so that you would be a good instructor. But we didn't know that Sally was going to take this course instead of Ted, or we didn't know Ted was going to take this course instead of Teresa. So those individuals were not specified at the beginning of, or at the time that the contract was entered into. A privity problem. We've already been throwing around the term privity a lot, but I didn't really define it. I know you were perhaps thinking, Gruber kind of missed the ball there. Why isn't she telling us what this thing privity is? Well, I was doing it as a little bit of a tease. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to leave you in suspense. It's kind of like withholding vital information in a murder mystery novel. So I'm going to reveal all now. What is privity? It's kind of a difficult concept to get one's head around. I'm not going to lie to you. This is the definition from, I don't know if it's from the textbook or if I pulled it from somewhere else. Let me read it and then we'll talk about it. Privity is an identity of interest between parties so that the legal interest of one party is measured by the same legal right as the other. It's continuity of interest. It's a successive relationship to the same right of property. I'm sure you're thinking to yourself, well, that was just about as clear as could be. I have zero questions about it. If that's your reaction, you're the only person who's ever had that reaction. So congratulations, you are a very, very special person and legal professional. Most of us hear that definition are like, huh? What is that? Well, the short answer is, for this course, it just means somebody who's a party to the contract, somebody who signed on the dotted line of the contract, if of course it's a written contract, or who has agreed to the terms of an oral contract. So when you think privity, just think parties to a contract. In my example, it's David debtor and Paul a promisor, or if we go back to our earlier transaction, it's dad and car dealership. People who are actually having duties under the contract. And so you see, the old rule, or the usual rule, this is still the usual rule, but the old rule is only parties in privity, the promisor and the promisee, the parties to the contract, have the right to enforce the contract. Today we're a little bit more loosey-goosey about this. We're in a world where we're not quite so categorical about things, I guess you could say. And so while privity is a really useful thing to have, and if you have privity, your ability to sue on the contract is going to be really, really good. If you don't have privity, you have nowadays a better shot at maybe being able to sue. But you may notice I have the word in italics. Even without privity, a third-party beneficiary may be able to successfully sue to enforce a contract against a promisor. Again, if it's an incidental beneficiary, not so much. Creditor beneficiaries, really good shot. Donee beneficiaries, maybe. Anyway, so this is an important concept that was kind of lurking in the background that I wanted to make explicit. Okay, so let's talk about the two exceptions to the privity idea. And we've already covered this first one, so I'm not really going to focus on this one anymore. We've talked about the direct beneficiary. We talked about, the intended beneficiary, whether it be a donee beneficiary or a creditor beneficiary. So that was kind of what we were focusing on the first 50% of this chapter. Our second topic is going to be when one of the contracting parties actually transfers either his or her rights or his or her duties under a contract to a third party. And then we'll be considering what this party's rights are under the contract. It's a little bit of a teaser. Don't mean to leave you in suspense, but I am going to end the lecture at this point because I know you're going to want to jump right into the next lecture to see what happens next in the thrilling account of third-party contracts. So if you can't go on and watch, I hope you can sleep tonight. The anticipation is going to be pretty intense. As always, I thank you for your attention, and I hope that you will reach out to me with any questions that you might have, either through my email, cgroover@collin.edu, or even better, come by and see me or call me during my office hours so that we can chat and I can help hopefully shine a light on whatever questions that you might have. It's been a pleasure making this presentation, and I look forward to seeing or hearing from you soon. Thanks so much.